Welcome to the Spitzen-Körper Thelema. We are reading from Francis Yates' Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition, published in 1964. This is the opening chapter, the foundation upon which Yates' entire thesis rests, the claim that Renaissance magic was built on a colossal historical mistake, one that shaped European intellectual life for 3 centuries. Yates belonged to the Warburg Institute Circle, that extraordinary cluster of German Jewish refugee scholars who remade cultural history after 1933. Her method was archival, biographical, and uncompromising. She asks not what a text claims to be, but what people believed it to be, and what they did as a result. This distinction matters urgently. Yates is arguing that the Renaissance returned to ancient wisdom, the animating force behind Facino, Pico, Agrippa, Bruno himself, was powered entirely by a dating error. The texts Renaissance mages revered as Egyptian antiquity were actually written between 100 and 300 AD, by Greek-speaking authors in the Greco-Roman Empire. They were not the fount of pristine wisdom. They were 2nd century syncretism, Platonism mixed with Stoicism, Jewish influences, possibly Persian ones, all wrapped in a pseudo-Egyptian costume. But the Renaissance believed them ancient, and from that belief flowed everything that followed. This passage establishes the conceptual frame. Yates shows how the entire Renaissance movement, humanist recovery of classical texts, religious reformation returning to scripture, was animated by a backward gaze, a cyclical view of time in which truth always lay in the past. The humanist recovered Cicero, the reformer recovered the Gospels, and the magus recovered what he thought was Egyptian wisdom predating both. All 3 were wrong about different things. But only the magus built an entire occult philosophy on his error. That error became generative. It allowed the Renaissance to imagine that Hermes Trismegistus, a mythical name attached to a corpus of Gnostic revelations and magical recipes, was a real Egyptian priest of remote antiquity, a figure predating Plato, from whom Plato himself had drunk. The scraps of Greek philosophy the Renaissance found in these texts seemed to confirm it. They had discovered the source. They were wrong. But wrongness, Yates shows, has consequences. The intellectual genealogy here is crucial. Yates inherits from A.E. Waite and Lynn Thorndike, both historians who took magic seriously as an intellectual phenomenon, not as mere superstition. But she adds something sharper, the insight that Renaissance magic is best understood not as a continuity with medieval magic or ancient practice, but as a Renaissance invention, built on mistaken dating and powered by humanist philology gone astray. Magic became philosophical, cosmological, systematic, became, in short, something new, precisely because the Renaissance believed it was recovering something infinitely old. Now the text itself. The great forward movements of the Renaissance all derive their vigor, their emotional impulse, from looking backwards. The cyclic view of time as a perpetual movement from pristine golden ages of purity and truth through successive brazen and iron ages still held sway, and the search for truth was thus of necessity a search for the early, the ancient, the original gold from which the baser metals of the present and the immediate past were corrupt to generations. Man's history was not an evolution from primitive animal origins through ever-growing complexity and progress. The past was always better than the present, and progress was revival, rebirth, Renaissance of antiquity. The classical humanist recovered the literature and the monuments of classical antiquity with a sense of return to the pure gold of a civilization better and higher than his own. The religious reformer returned to the study of the scriptures and the early fathers with a sense of recovery of the pure gold of the gospel, buried under later degenerations. These are truisms, and it is also obvious that both these great returning movements were not mistaken as to the date of the earlier, better period to which they turned. The humanist knew the date of Cicero, knew the correct date of his golden age of classical culture. The reformer, even if not clear as to the date of the Gospels, knew that he was trying to return to the earliest centuries of Christianity. But the returning movement of the Renaissance with which this book will be concerned, the return to a pure golden age of magic, was based on a radical error in dating. The works which inspired the Renaissance magus, and what he believed to be of profound antiquity, were really written in the 2nd to the 3rd centuries AD. He was not returning to an Egyptian wisdom, not much later than the wisdom of the Hebrew patriarchs and prophets, and much earlier than Plato and the other philosophers of Greek antiquity, who had all, so the Renaissance magus firmly believed, drunk from its sacred fountain. He's returning to the pagan background of early Christianity, to that religion of the world, strongly tinged with magic and Oriental influences, which was the Gnostic version of Greek philosophy, and the refuge of weary pagans seeking an answer to life's problems other than that offered by their contemporaries, the early Christians. The Egyptian god, Thoth, the scribe of the gods and the divinity of wisdom, was identified by the Greeks with their Hermes and sometimes given the epithet of thrice great. The Latins took over this identification of Hermes or Mercurius with Thoth, and Cicero in his De Natura Deorum explains that there were really 5 Mercuries, the 5th being he who killed Argus and consequently fled in exile to Egypt where he gave the Egyptians their laws and letters and took the Egyptian name of Thoth or Thoth. A large literature in Greek developed under the name of Hermes Trismegistus, concerned with astrology and the occult sciences, with the secret virtues of plants and stones and the sympathetic magic based on knowledge of such virtues, with the making of talismans for drawing down the powers of the stars, and so on. Besides these treatises or recipes for the practice of astral magic going under the name of Hermes, there also developed a philosophical literature to which the same revered name was attached. It is not known when the Hermetic framework was first used for philosophy, but the Asclepius and the Corpus Hermeticum, which are the most important of the philosophical Hermetica which have come down to us, are probably to be dated between AD 100 and 300. Though cast in a pseudo-Egyptian framework, these works have been thought by many scholars to contain very few genuine Egyptian elements. In any case, however, they were certainly not written in remotest antiquity by an all-wise Egyptian priest, as the Renaissance believed, but by various unknown authors, all probably Greeks, and they contain popular Greek philosophy of the period, a mixture of Platonism and Stoicism, combined with some Jewish and probably some Persian influences. They are very diverse, but they all breathe an atmosphere of intense piety. The Asclepius purports to describe the religion of the Egyptians, and by what magic rites and processes the Egyptians drew down the powers of the cosmos into the statues of their gods. This treatise has come down to us through the Latin translation formerly attributed to Apuleius of Madaura. The commander gives an account of the creation of the world which is in parts reminiscent of Genesis. Other treatises describe the ascent of the soul through the spheres of the planets to the divine realms above them, or give ecstatic descriptions of a process of regeneration by which the soul casts off the chains which bind it to the material world and becomes filled with divine powers and virtues. In the first volume of his work, La Révélation de Hermes Trismegistus, Festugier has analyzed the state of mind of the epoch, roughly the 2nd century after the birth of Christ, in which the Asclepius and the Hermetic treatises which have reached us in the Corpus Hermeticum collection were written. Externally that world was highly organized and at peace. The Pax Romana was at the height of its efficiency and the mixed populations of the empire were governed by an efficient bureaucracy. Communications along the great Roman roads were excellent. The educated classes had absorbed the Greco-Roman type of culture, based on the 7 liberal arts. The mental and spiritual condition of this world was curious. The mighty intellectual effort of Greek philosophy was exhausted, had come to a standstill, to a dead end, perhaps because Greek thinking never took the momentous step of experimental verification of its hypotheses, a step which was not to be taken until 15 centuries later with the birth of modern scientific thinking in the 17th century. The world of the 2nd century was weary of Greek dialectics which seemed to lead to no certain results. Platonists, Stoics, Epicureans could only repeat the theories of their various schools without making any further advances, and the tenets of the schools were boiled down in textbook form, in manuals which formed the basis of philosophical instruction within the empire. Insofar as it is Greek in origin, the philosophy of the Hermetic writings is of this standardized type, with its smattering of Platonism, Neoplatonism, Stoicism, and the other Greek schools of thought. This world of the 2nd century was, however, seeking intensively for knowledge of reality, for an answer to its problems which the normal education failed to give. It turned to other ways of seeking an answer, intuitive, mystical, magical. Since reason seemed to have failed, it sought to cultivate the nous, the intuitive faculty in man. Philosophy was to be used, not as a dialectical exercise, but as a way of reaching intuitive knowledge of the divine and of the meaning of the world, as a gnosis, in short, to be prepared for by ascetic discipline and a religious way of life. The Hermetic treatises, which often take the form of dialogues between master and disciple, usually culminate in a kind of ecstasy in which the adept is satisfied that he has received an illumination and breaks out into hymns of praise. He seems to reach this illumination through contemplation of the world or the cosmos, or rather through contemplation of the cosmos as reflected in his own nous or mens, which separates out for him its divine meaning and gives him a spiritual mastery over it, as in the familiar Gnostic revelation or experience of the ascent of the soul through the spheres of the planets to become immersed in the divine. Thus that religion of the world which runs as an undercurrent in much of Greek thought, particularly in Platonism and Stoicism, becomes in Hermetism actually a religion, a cult without temples or liturgy, followed in the mind alone, a religious philosophy or philosophical religion containing a gnosis. The men of the 2nd century were thoroughly imbued with the idea that what is old is pure and holy, that the earliest thinkers walked more closely with the gods than the busy rationalists, their successors. Hence the strong revival of Pythagoreanism in this age. They also had the impression that what is remote and far distant is more holy, hence their cult of the barbarians, of Indian gymnosophists, Persian magi, Chaldean astrologers, whose approach to knowledge was felt to be more religious than that of the Greeks. In the melting pot of the empire, in which all religions were tolerated, there was ample opportunity for making acquaintance with Oriental cults. Above all, it was the Egyptians who were revered in this age. Egyptian temples were still functioning, and devout seekers after religious truth and revelation in the Greco-Roman world would make pilgrimages to some remotely situated Egyptian temple and pass the night in its vicinity in the hope of receiving some vision of divine mysteries and dreams. The belief that Egypt was the original home of all knowledge, that the great Greek philosophers had visited it and conversed with Egyptian priests, had long been current, and, in the mood of the 2nd century, the ancient and mysterious religion of Egypt, the supposed profound knowledge of its priests, their ascetic way of life, the religious magic which they were thought to perform in the subterranean chambers of their temples, offered immense attractions. It is this pro-Egyptian mood of the Greco-Roman world which is reflected in the Hermetic Asclepius with its strange description of the magic by which the Egyptian priests animated the statues of their gods, and its moving prophecy that the most ancient Egyptian religion is destined to come to an end. In that hour, so the supposed Egyptian priest, Hermes Trismegistus, tells his disciple, Asclepius, in that hour, weary of life, men will no longer regard the world as the worthy object of their admiration and reverence. This all, which is a good thing, the best that can be seen in the past, the present, and the future, will be in danger of perishing, men will esteem it a burden, and thenceforward this whole of the universe will be despised and no longer cherished, this incomparable work of God, glorious construction, all good creation made up of an infinite diversity of forms, instrument of the will of God who, without envy, lavishes his favor upon his work, in which is assembled in one all, in a harmonious diversity, all that can be seen which is worthy of reverence, praise and love. Thus Egypt, and its magical religion, becomes identified with the Hermetic religion of the world. So we can understand how the content of the Hermetic writings fostered the illusion of the Renaissance magus that he had in them a mysterious and precious account of most ancient Egyptian wisdom, philosophy, and magic. Hermes Trismegistus, a mythical name associated with a certain class of Gnostic philosophical revelations or with magical treatises and recipes, was, for the Renaissance, a real person, an Egyptian priest who had lived in times of remote antiquity and who had himself written all these works. The scraps of Greek philosophy which he found in these writings, derived from the somewhat debased philosophical teaching current in the early centuries AD, confirmed the Renaissance reader in his belief that he had here the fount of pristine wisdom whence Plato and the Greeks had derived the best that they knew. This huge historical error was to have amazing results. It was on excellent authority that the Renaissance accepted Hermes Trismegistus as a real person of great antiquity and as the author of the Hermetic writings, for this was implicitly believed by leading fathers of the Church, particularly Lactantius and Augustine. Naturally, it would not have occurred to anyone to doubt that these overwhelmingly authoritative writers must be right, and it is indeed a remarkable testimony to the prominence and importance of the Hermetic writings and to the early and complete success of the Hermes Trismegistus legend as to their authorship and antiquity that Lactantius, writing in the 3rd century, and Augustine in the 4th, Both accept the legend unquestioningly. After quoting Cicero on the fifth Mercury as he who gave letters and laws to the Egyptians, Lactantius, in his Institutes, goes on to say that this Egyptian Hermes, although he was a man, yet he was of great antiquity, and most fully imbued with every kind of learning, so that the knowledge of many subjects and arts acquired for him the name of Trismegistus. He wrote books, and those in great number, relating to the knowledge of divine things, in which he asserts the majesty of the supreme and only God, and makes mention of him by the same names which we use, God and Father. By these many books, Lactantius certainly means some of the Hermetic writings which have come down to us, for he makes several quotations from some of the treatises of the Corpus Hermeticum and also from the Asclepius. What Yates has given us here is the diagnostic moment. She has shown the machinery of the error, how a mythical name became a historical person, how 2nd century syncretism masqueraded as Egyptian wisdom, how church fathers, Lactantius, Augustine, authenticated a legend by their own authority, never questioning whether the texts could be dated. The Renaissance inherited this unchallenged patristic authority. To doubt Lactantius would have been unthinkable. And so what began as a plausible confusion in late antiquity, mistaking pseudo-Egyptian allegory for genuine Egyptian antiquity, calcified into received doctrine by the time Marsilio Ficino opened these texts in 15th century Florence. The deeper argument is this: the Renaissance did not inherit magic as a living practice. It invented magic as a philosophy, and it did so by reading texts of believed ancient but which were actually recent, texts written by exhausted Greek philosophers and Gnostic seekers trying to make reason speak to the soul again. When Renaissance mages like Agrippa and Bruno read Hermes, they were reading 2nd century despair dressed in Egyptian robes and mistaking it for Egyptian wisdom. But that mistake was fertile. It allowed them to imagine that philosophy and magic were not opposed but identical, that the cosmos was alive and meaningful, that sympathetic knowledge, the nous contemplating the nous in things, was not fancy but truth. The error generated a method. And the method changed Europe. Next, D.P. Walker, Spiritual and Demonic Magic from Ficino to Campanella. The Spitzen-Körper Thelema. If this archive serves you, support it on Patreon. Link in the description.